The last note echoed through the magnificent Carnegie Hall like a whisper that refused to die. Alexander Romano lifted his hands from the piano keys and felt the familiar rush of electricity that always came after a perfect performance. For a moment, the world stood perfectly still. 3,000 people sat in complete silence, as if they were afraid to breathe and break the magic that still hung in the air. Then it happened. The applause erupted like thunder, rolling through the hall in waves that seemed to shake the very walls. Alexander stood slowly, his tall frame elegant in his perfectly tailored black tuxedo. He turned toward the audience and offered the slightest bow, just enough to show respect but not so much as to appear humble. After all, he knew exactly how good he was. The standing ovation continued for what felt like forever. Alexander could see faces in the crowd, their expressions filled with wonder and amazement. Some people had tears streaming down their cheeks. Others stood with their mouths slightly open, still processing what they had just witnessed. In the front row, he spotted the famous music critic from the New York Times applauding with genuine enthusiasm. That would make tomorrow's review interesting. Alexander had just performed one of the most challenging pieces in classical music, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, and he had made it look effortless. His fingers had danced across the keys, like they were extensions of his soul. Every note had been perfect, every emotion precisely controlled and delivered with surgical precision. As the applause finally began to fade, Alexander walked off stage with the confidence of a man who had never known failure. His manager, Robert, was waiting in the wings with a huge smile on his face. "Absolutely incredible," Robert said, shaking his head in amazement. "I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've never heard anything like that. The way you handled the third movement was pure genius." Alexander simply nodded, as if this level of praise was exactly what he expected to hear. Because it was. He had been performing at this level for so long that excellence had become routine. Ordinary had been left behind somewhere in his teenage years. The backstage area quickly filled with people. First came the orchestra members, still buzzing with excitement from sharing the stage with Alexander. The conductor, an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes, approached with obvious respect. 27 years I've been conducting," he said, placing a gentle hand on Alexander's shoulder. "I thought I had heard everything. But tonight, you made that piano sing in ways I didn't know were possible. That second movement, the way you brought out those delicate passages, it was like listening to poetry written in music." Alexander accepted the compliment with the same cool confidence he showed everything else in his life. "The secret is understanding that the piano isn't just an instrument," he replied. "It's a conversation partner. You have to know how to speak. It's language." More people continued to flood backstage. Wealthy patrons who had paid thousands for their tickets wanted to shake his hand and tell him how his music had moved them. Young music students looked at him with the kind of admiration usually reserved for movie stars. Fellow musicians, some of whom Alexander recognized from other prestigious venues, waited patiently for their chance to express their appreciation. A well-dressed woman in her 60s approached, her eyes still bright with emotion from the performance. "Mr. Romano," she said, her voice slightly breathless, "I've been attending concerts at Carnegie Hall for 40 years. My late husband and I, we never missed a season. Tonight was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. You have a gift that comes from somewhere beyond this world." Alexander smiled politely and thanked her, but inside he felt the familiar surge of superiority. These people acted like what he did was some kind of miracle, when really it was just the result of natural talent combined with years of dedicated practice. Not everyone could do what he did, of course, but that was simply because not everyone was born with his abilities. A group of music journalists had managed to get backstage access. and they surrounded Alexander with their notebooks and recording devices. The questions came rapid fire. How do you maintain such perfect technique while still conveying so much emotion? What's next for you after a performance like this? Do you ever feel pressure knowing that you're considered one of the greatest living pianists? Alexander answered each question with practiced ease, giving responses that sounded thoughtful but revealed very little about his actual thoughts. He had learned long ago how to say the right things to the press while keeping his true feelings safely hidden. The truth was, Alexander felt pressure, but not the kind these journalists might expect. His pressure didn't come from fear of failure or worry about disappointing people. His pressure came from the burden of always being the best, of always having to prove that his reputation was deserved. It was the pressure of carrying the weight of his own legend. As the crowd began to thin out, Alexander found himself talking with a fellow pianist who had traveled from Boston, specifically to hear tonight's performance. "I have to ask," the man said, lowering his voice slightly, "how do you do it? How do you make something so technically demanding look so effortless?" Alexander considered the question for a moment. "It's about understanding your own capabilities." He finally answered, "Most people limit themselves by believing they can't achieve greatness. I simply refuse to accept limitations." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Alexander's mind had already begun to drift toward tomorrow. There would be another city, another concert hall, another audience waiting to be amazed. This was his life, and he lived it exactly the way he wanted to. As the last of the well-wishers finally departed, Alexander stood alone in the now quiet backstage area. His reflection stared back at him from a mirror on the wall, still looking composed and in control. His hair remained perfectly styled despite the energy he had put into the performance. His tuxedo showed no signs of the physical effort required to play such demanding music. He straightened his bow tie and prepared to leave. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate his superior abilities. He had conquered Carnegie Hall once again, just as he had conquered every other major venue in the world. There wasn't a piano anywhere that could intimidate him, wasn't an audience anywhere that he couldn't captivate. Alexander Romano walked out of Carnegie Hall that night with the absolute certainty that he was untouchable in his musical domain. He had no idea that in just a few hours his entire understanding of music, talent, and humility would be turned completely upside down by someone he would never have expected. 2 hours after his triumphant Carnegie Hall performance, Alexander Romano stepped out of a black limousine in front of the most exclusive address on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The evening air was crisp, and the city lights twinkled like diamonds against the dark sky. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket and walked confidently toward the entrance of the Whitmore Mansion, where tonight's private fundraiser was already in full swing. The mansion belonged to Victoria Whitmore, one of New York's most influential philanthropists, and a longtime patron of the arts. Her annual fundraisers were legendary among the city's elite, bringing together the wealthiest and most powerful people to support various charitable causes. Tonight's event was raising money for the children's wing of Metropolitan General Hospital, and the guest list read like a who's who of New York society. Alexander had been personally invited by Victoria herself, who had been in the audience tonight and wanted to celebrate his magnificent performance. As he approached the grand entrance, flanked by marble columns and adorned with fresh flowers, he could already hear the gentle murmur of sophisticated conversation and the soft tinkling of champagne glasses. A doorman in white gloves opened the heavy wooden door, and Alexander stepped into another world. The mansion's foyer was breathtaking, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over polished marble floors and walls lined with priceless artwork. Well-dressed servers moved gracefully through the crowd, offering champagne and delicate appetizers. On silver trays, Victoria Whitmore spotted Alexander immediately and glided toward him with the practiced elegance of someone born into high society. She was in her early 70s but carried herself with the poise of a woman half her age. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, and she wore a stunning emerald necklace that probably cost more than most people's houses. "Alexander, darling," she said, taking both his hands in hers, "that performance tonight was absolutely divine. I swear I saw angels weeping during the second movement. You must tell me how you managed to make that piano sound like it's singing." Alexander smiled and kissed her hand in the old-fashioned way that always charmed wealthy patrons. "The piano and I simply understand each other, Victoria. When you've reached a certain level of mastery, the instrument becomes an extension of your soul." Victoria's eyes sparkled with delight. "Oh, you must meet everyone. They're all dying to talk with you." She began leading him through the crowd, introducing him to mayors, judges, business moguls, and famous artists. Each introduction was followed by glowing praise for his evening's performance and requests for his thoughts on music, art, and life. Alexander moved through these conversations with practiced ease. He had attended dozens of these high society gatherings over the years, and he knew exactly how to charm each type of person. With the business leaders, he spoke about the discipline and dedication required for excellence. With the artists, he discussed the deeper meaning of classical music. With the socialites, he was witty and sophisticated. The main reception room was magnificent, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park and furniture that belonged in a museum. A string quartet played softly in one corner, while guests mingled and discussed everything from politics to the latest Broadway shows. The air was filled with expensive perfume, fine wine, and the confidence that comes from having more money than you could spend in several lifetimes. As Alexander accepted another glass of champagne from a passing server, he noticed something that seemed out of place. In a far corner of the room, sitting quietly on a small chair, was a woman who clearly didn't belong with this crowd. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. While everyone else wore designer gowns and expensive suits, she was dressed in a clean but obviously inexpensive black dress that looked like it might have come from a department store. The woman sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the crowd with quiet dignity but obvious discomfort. She looked like she was trying very hard to make herself invisible, which only made her stand out more among the confident, outgoing guests who filled the rest of the room. Alexander's curiosity was piqued. What was someone like that doing at Victoria Whitmore's exclusive fundraiser? Security at these events was typically very tight, with guest lists carefully controlled. He began moving in her direction, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly because her presence seemed to challenge the perfect order of the evening. As he got closer, he could see more details about the woman. Her face showed the kind of tiredness that comes from years of hard work, but her posture remained dignified despite her obvious discomfort. Her hands, he noticed, were rough and calloused, clearly belonging to someone who worked with them every day. She wore no jewelry except for a simple gold wedding band that looked like it had been worn for many years. Before Alexander could approach her, a young woman in her 20s appeared with a tray of empty glasses. She was dressed in the black and white uniform of the catering staff, but there was something different about the way she moved. Unlike the professional servers hired for the event, she seemed nervous and inexperienced, as if this was her first time working such an elegant gathering. "Mama," the young woman whispered in Spanish, leaning down toward the older woman. "Estás bien? You don't have to stay if you're uncomfortable." The older woman looked up with gentle eyes and smiled. "I'm fine, Mia. You worked so hard to get this volunteer position. I want to be here to support you." Alexander was close enough now to hear their conversation, and the pieces began falling into place. The young woman was obviously volunteering to help serve at the fundraiser, probably through some community program, and she had brought her mother along. The older woman wasn't a guest at all, just someone trying to support her daughter's efforts. He watched as the daughter hurried back to work, clearly eager to do well at her volunteer position. The mother remained seated, looking around the room with a mixture of wonder and unease. She seemed fascinated by the beautiful surroundings, but also very aware that she didn't belong in this world of wealth and privilege. Alexander found himself studying her more carefully. There was something about the way she carried herself that intrigued him. Despite her obvious discomfort and simple clothing, she had a quiet dignity that was unmistakable. She didn't seem embarrassed or ashamed, just out of place. It was like watching a wildflower that had somehow found itself in a garden of exotic orchids. Other guests occasionally glanced in her direction, and Alexander could see the subtle looks of confusion and mild disapproval. In their world, everything had its proper place, and someone like this woman didn't fit into their carefully ordered universe. Some whispered quietly to each other, clearly wondering how she had ended up at such an exclusive event. But the woman seemed unaware of these whispered conversations. She sat quietly, occasionally smiling when she watched her daughter successfully navigate another serving task. Her pride in her daughter was obvious and touching, even to someone as self-centered as Alexander. Victoria Whitmore approached Alexander again, following his gaze toward the corner where the woman sat. "Oh, that's Carmen Santos," she explained quietly. "Her daughter Isabella is volunteering tonight through our community outreach program. The girl has been working so hard to better herself, taking night classes while working multiple jobs. When she asked if her mother could come along for moral support, we couldn't very well say no." Alexander nodded thoughtfully, still watching Carmen Santos. Something about her quiet presence was beginning to irritate him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the way she seemed so content to just observe, or maybe it was how her simple dignity seemed to highlight the artificial nature of everything else around them. "What does she do for work?" Alexander asked, though he was already forming assumptions based on her appearance. "Oh, she's a janitor at Metropolitan General Hospital," Victoria replied. "Works the night shift, I believe. Probably been doing that kind of work her whole life. Sweet woman, very humble. You can tell she's not comfortable here, but she's trying so hard to support her daughter." Alexander felt a familiar surge of superiority. Here was the perfect example of the vast difference between people like him and people like Carmen Santos. He had spent his life mastering one of the most sophisticated art forms in human history, while she spent her nights mopping floors and emptying trash cans. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. As the evening continued, Alexander found his attention drifting back to Carmen Santos again and again. She remained in her corner, a quiet island of simplicity in an ocean of wealth and sophistication. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, her presence was beginning to annoy him more and more. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself drinking more champagne than usual. Each glass seemed to fuel his already inflated ego, and the constant stream of compliments from wealthy guests only made things worse. By his fourth glass, he was feeling invincible, like he could conquer the world with nothing but his talent and charm. The conversations around him had become increasingly focused on his greatness. A prominent art dealer had just finished comparing him to Mozart. A Supreme Court justice had declared that Alexander's music could bring world peace. A tech billionaire had offered to fund a documentary about his life. With each praise-filled conversation, Alexander felt himself rising higher above everyone else in the room. "You know," said a famous Broadway producer, swirling his own glass of champagne, "I've been thinking about your performance tonight all evening, the way you played. That Rachmaninoff piece, it wasn't just music. It was like watching a master painter create a masterpiece right before our eyes. Alexander nodded sagely, as if this comparison was not only accurate but obvious. "Music at the highest level transcends the physical realm," he replied, his voice carrying just a hint of condescension. "It requires not just technical skill, but a spiritual connection that very few people can achieve." The small group of admirers hanging on his every word murmured their agreement. Alexander could see the awe in their eyes, the way they looked at him like he was some kind of divine being who had descended from heaven to grace them with his presence. It was intoxicating, more powerful than any drug. Across the room, he caught sight of the magnificent grand piano that dominated one corner of Victoria's main reception area. It was a concert-quality Steinway, probably worth more than most people's houses, sitting there like a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. The sight of it sent a familiar thrill through Alexander's chest. "You know what?" he announced suddenly, setting down his champagne glass with dramatic flair. "I think this evening calls for a little music." The suggestion was met with immediate enthusiasm from his small audience. Word began to spread quickly through the room that Alexander Romano might actually perform at the fundraiser. Conversations quieted as more and more guests turned their attention toward the piano area. Alexander strode confidently across the room, his movements fluid and purposeful. He could feel dozens of eyes following him, and he loved every second of it. This was his element, his natural habitat. Behind a piano, he was more than human. He was an artist, a creator, a god among mortals. He settled onto the piano bench and flexed his fingers dramatically. The room had fallen almost completely. Silent now, with guests gathering in a loose semicircle around the instrument. Even the professional string quartet had stopped playing. Recognizing that they were about to witness something special, without any announcement or introduction, Alexander began to play. His fingers flew across the keys in a dazzling display of technical virtuosity. He started with a piece by Liszt, one of the most challenging compositions ever written for piano, and made it sound effortless. Every note was crystal clear, every phrase perfectly shaped, every dynamic change executed with surgical precision. The crowd was mesmerized. Alexander could see the amazement on their faces, the way their mouths hung slightly open as they watched his hands move with impossible speed and accuracy. Some people were filming with their phones, probably planning to share videos of this impromptu concert with their friends. He transitioned seamlessly from the Liszt into a Chopin ballade, then into some jazz improvisation that showed off his versatility. The piano seemed to come alive under his touch, producing sounds that ranged from whisper-soft to thunderously powerful. He was completely in control, bending the instrument to his will like a master craftsman working with his finest tools. "Incredible," someone whispered behind him. "Absolutely incredible." Alexander smiled to himself as he played, feeding off the energy and admiration of his audience. This was what he lived for, these moments when his superiority was on full display, for everyone to see. There wasn't another person in this room, or probably in this entire city, who could do what he was doing right now. As he finished his impromptu performance with a flourish, the room erupted in applause. People were shaking their heads in disbelief, talking excitedly to each other about what they had just witnessed. Alexander stood and took a bow, soaking in the adoration like a plant absorbing sunlight. "That was magnificent," Victoria Whitmore gushed, approaching the piano with tears of joy in her eyes. "Simply magnificent. You've turned my little fundraiser into a concert that people will remember for the rest of their lives." Alexander basked in the praise, but as he looked around the room, his eyes fell on Carmen Santos, still sitting quietly in her corner. While everyone else had gathered around the piano to watch his performance, she had remained in her seat, though he could tell she had been paying close attention. There was something about her focused expression that caught his attention. Alcohol in his system, combined with his inflated ego and the rush of performing, began to create a dangerous combination. Looking at Carmen sitting there in her simple dress, so obviously out of place among all these sophisticated people, Alexander felt a surge of condescending superiority that was stronger than anything he had experienced all evening. "You know," he said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "music is truly a universal language. It speaks to everyone, regardless of their background or education level." Several guests nodded in agreement, though some seemed confused about where Alexander was going with this observation. Alexander began walking slowly toward Carmen's corner, his movements deliberate and theatrical. "Take our friend over there, for example," he continued, gesturing toward Carmen with what he thought was a benevolent smile. "I noticed how intently she was listening to my performance. Music has the power to touch even the simplest souls." Carmen looked up as Alexander approached, her expression calm but wary. She could sense that something was happening, though she wasn't sure what. Other guests began turning to look in her direction, creating an uncomfortable spotlight of attention. "You seemed very focused on the music," Alexander said directly to Carmen, his voice carrying a tone that was meant to sound friendly but came across as patronizing. "Have you ever had the opportunity to try playing piano yourself?" Carmen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "No, Senator," she replied quietly. "I don't know how to play." Alexander's smile widened, and he turned to address the crowd as much as Carmen. "Well, that's perfectly understandable. Piano is an incredibly complex instrument that requires years of study and natural ability. Not everyone can master it." He turned back to Carmen, and what happened next would later be remembered by everyone in that room as one of the most shocking displays of arrogance they had ever witnessed. "But you know what?" Alexander announced, his voice growing louder and more theatrical. "I believe everyone should have a chance to experience the joy of music. Carmen, isn't it? Would you like to try playing something on this beautiful piano?" The room fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Carmen's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced around at all the faces now staring at her. Some guests looked embarrassed by Alexander's behavior, while others seemed curious about what would happen next. "I'm sure someone like you has always dreamed of playing such a magnificent instrument," Alexander continued, his tone becoming more condescending with each word. "This is probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for you. Don't worry about making mistakes. We all understand that you don't have any training." Carmen's daughter Isabella had been serving drinks near the back of the room, but she quickly made her way through the crowd when she heard what was happening. Her face showed a mixture of anger and protective concern for her mother. "Mama," Isabella said softly in Spanish, "you don't have to do anything you don't want to do." But Carmen was looking directly at Alexander now, and something had changed. In her expression, the wariness was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Something that looked almost like resolve. "Perhaps just something very simple," Alexander pressed on, completely oblivious to the shift in Carmen's demeanor. "Maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? I'm sure even someone with no musical background could manage that." The condescension in his voice was now so thick that several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Victoria Whitmore looked like she wanted to intervene but wasn't sure how. The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Carmen slowly rose from her chair, her movements careful and dignified despite the awkward situation. All eyes were on her as she smoothed down her simple black dress and looked once more at her daughter, who nodded encouragingly despite her obvious concern. "I suppose I could try something simple," Carmen said quietly, her accented English clear despite her nervousness. "Though I should warn you, I haven't played in many years." Alexander clapped, his hands together dramatically. Wonderful. How delightfully humble. Please, don't be nervous. We're all friends here, and we certainly don't expect anything too sophisticated. As Carmen began walking slowly toward the piano, the crowd parted to make way for her. Alexander stepped aside with an exaggerated bow, still wearing his condescending smile. Carmen Santos sat at the piano bench with her hands resting gently in her lap, staring at the black and white keys that stretched out before her like a familiar yet distant memory. The silence in the room was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Every single person in Victoria Whitmore's mansion had their eyes fixed on her, waiting to see what would happen next. She could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, some pitying, and others clearly expecting her to embarrass herself. A few guests near the back of the room were barely containing their smirks, already anticipating the amusing spectacle of a simple janitor attempting to play a concert-quality piano in front of New York's elite. Alexander Romano stood just a few feet away, his arms still crossed and that condescending smile still plastered across his face. He was practically radiating superiority, clearly enjoying this moment that he believed would highlight the vast difference between someone like him and someone like Carmen. In his mind, this was going to be a harmless bit of entertainment that would make everyone appreciate his own talents even more. "Take your time," Alexander said in a voice that dripped with fake kindness. "There's absolutely no pressure here. We're all just curious to hear what you might be able to manage." Carmen's daughter Isabella had pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her face a mixture of concern and protective anger. She wanted to tell everyone to leave her mother alone, to explain that this whole situation was unfair and cruel. But she also knew her mother well enough to recognize the look in her eyes. Carmen had made a decision, and nothing was going to change her mind now. "Mama," Isabella whispered, leaning closer to the piano, "you don't have to do this. We can just leave." Carmen looked up at her daughter with gentle eyes that held more strength than anyone in that room could have imagined. "It's okay, Mia," she said softly. "Sometimes people need to learn that things are not always what they seem." The cryptic comment confused Isabella, but before she could ask what her mother meant, Carmen had already turned her attention back to the piano keys. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work, hovered just inches above the keyboard. Alexander chuckled quietly. "Maybe start with something everyone knows," he suggested helpfully. "Perhaps Mary Had a Little Lamb? That's usually a good place for beginners to start." Several guests shifted uncomfortably at the obvious condescension in Alexander's voice, but no one spoke up to stop what was happening. They were all too curious to see how this strange situation would play out. Carmen's fingers were trembling. Slightly, but not from nervousness in the way that everyone assumed. The trembling came from something much deeper, much more complex. It had been so long since she had sat at a piano like this, so long since she had felt the smooth touch of quality keys beneath her fingertips. The sensation was bringing back a flood of memories that she had carefully locked away for over 30 years. She could remember another time, another piano, another audience. But that was a different life, a different world that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. That was before responsibility had forced her to make impossible choices, before survival had become more important than dreams. "Really, don't be nervous," Alexander continued, his voice growing louder so that everyone could hear his generous encouragement. "We all understand that you've probably never had the opportunity to receive proper musical education. No one expects anything sophisticated." Victoria Whitmore finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Alexander, perhaps we should—" "Oh no, please," Alexander interrupted with a wave of his hand. "I insist that Carmen have her moment. Everyone deserves a chance to experience the joy of music regardless of their background or abilities. Carmen closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. When she opened them again, something had shifted. The uncertainty was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Something that looked almost like resolve, mixed with a sadness that was too deep for words. "I should tell you," Carmen said quietly, her voice barely audible in the silent room, "that I haven't played in many, many years. My hands are not what they used to be." Alexander nodded enthusiastically. Of course. We completely understand. Physical labor takes its toll on the hands, I'm sure. Just do whatever feels comfortable." Carmen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the comment about physical labor, but she said nothing. Instead, she began to position her hands over the keys, her posture straightening in a way that seemed somehow familiar, as if her body was remembering something that her mind had tried to forget. Isabella watched her mother with growing confusion. There was something different about the way Carmen was sitting now, something about her posture and the way she held her hands that didn't match the image of a woman who had never touched a piano before. "Mama?" Isabella whispered, but Carmen seemed lost in her own thoughts. The crowd pressed closer, everyone wanting to get the best view of what they assumed would be an awkward but harmless attempt at playing a simple melody. Some people had their phones out, ready to record what they thought might be an amusing moment to share with friends later. Alexander positioned himself where he could see both Carmen and the audience, clearly planning to offer gentle guidance and encouragement when she inevitably struggled. He was already composing the gracious words he would use to praise her effort while subtly emphasizing how difficult piano really was for someone without proper training. Carmen's hands were positioned over the keys now, her fingers curved in a way that looked surprisingly natural. She sat still for a long moment, as if she was having an internal conversation with herself about something very important. "Would you like me to suggest a simple piece?" Alexander offered helpfully. "Maybe. Something with just a few notes? I could even play it first to show you." For the first time since sitting down, Carmen looked directly at Alexander. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that made him slightly uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "That's very kind of you," Carmen said slowly, "but I think I know what I want to play." Alexander raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Oh? Well, that's wonderful. What did you have in mind?" Carmen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the keys again, her fingers making tiny movements as if they were remembering something from long ago. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. "Perhaps something you heard on the radio?" Alexander pressed, his patience beginning to wear thin. "Or maybe a simple folk song from your childhood?" Carmen's hands settled onto the keys, not pressing them yet but simply feeling their familiar weight and texture. "Actually," she said quietly, "I was thinking of something by Chopin." The room erupted in barely suppressed snickers and uncomfortable laughter. Alexander's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and his condescending smile grew even wider. "Chopin?" he repeated as if he hadn't heard correctly. "My dear Carmen, Chopin is one of the most technically demanding composers who ever lived. His pieces require years of classical training and exceptional finger dexterity. Perhaps we should start with something a bit more accessible?" Carmen looked up at him again, and this time Alexander could definitely see something in her expression that he didn't understand. It wasn't embarrassment or confusion. If anything, it looked almost like pity. "I understand," Carmen said softly. "But if it's all the same to you, I'd like to try the Minute Waltz." The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Several guests exchanged shocked glances. The Minute Waltz was one of Chopin's most famous pieces, but it was also notoriously difficult, requiring lightning-fast fingerwork and perfect technique. For someone with no musical training to even suggest attempting it was beyond absurd. Alexander's smile faltered for just a moment before returning even brighter than before. "Well," he said with a laugh that sounded forced, "I certainly admire your ambition. Though I should warn you, that particular piece is considered quite challenging even for professional pianists. Are you absolutely sure you wouldn't prefer something simpler?" Carmen's fingers pressed lightly against the keys, not hard enough to make sound but enough to feel their responsiveness. "I'm sure," she said quietly. Isabella stared at her mother in complete confusion. She had never seen her mother display any interest in classical music, let alone claim knowledge of specific pieces by famous composers. What was happening here? Alexander shrugged dramatically for the benefit of his audience. "Well then, by all means, please proceed. I'm sure we're all very curious to see how this turns out." The condescension in his voice was now so obvious that even the most oblivious guests were beginning to feel uncomfortable. But no one knew how to stop what was happening, and everyone was too curious about the outcome to intervene. Carmen positioned her hands properly over the keys, her posture becoming more refined with each passing second. She took one final deep breath, looked once more at her daughter's concerned face, and then fixed her gaze on the piano keys. "Forgive me if I'm a bit rusty," she said quietly. "It's been 32 years since I last performed this piece." The word "performed" hung in the air like a question mark that no one understood. The first notes that came from the piano were so soft that some people in the back of the room had to lean forward to hear them. Carmen's fingers touched the keys with the gentleness of someone greeting an old friend after a very long separation. Those initial sounds were delicate, almost hesitant, like the first words spoken after decades of silence. But then something magical began to happen. As Carmen's fingers found their rhythm, the hesitation melted away like snow in the spring sun. Her hands began to move with increasing confidence, and the notes that flowed from the piano started to take on a life of their own. What had begun as uncertainty was transforming into something else entirely. Alexander stood frozen in place, his condescending smile beginning to fade as he listened to the sounds coming from the instrument. These weren't the clumsy attempts of a beginner. These weren't the simple melodies he had expected to hear. This was something completely different. Carmen's left hand began the familiar opening passage of Chopin's Minute Waltz, and the melody that emerged was both delicate and precise. Her fingers moved across the keys with a fluidity that spoke of years of training and practice. Each note was perfectly placed, each phrase carefully shaped with a kind of musical intelligence that couldn't be faked. The crowd began to shift uneasily. The snickers and barely contained laughter that had filled the room just moments before died away completely. People exchanged confused glances, trying to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't what anyone had expected. Isabella's eyes widened as she watched her mother's hands dance across the keyboard. She had never seen her mother like this before. The woman sitting at the piano bench looked the same as always, but something fundamental had changed. Her posture was different, more refined. Her movements were graceful and confident in a way that Isabella had never noticed before. "What the hell?" someone whispered from the back of the room, voicing what everyone was thinking but no one else dared to say out loud. Alexander took a step closer to the piano, his face showing the first signs of genuine confusion. The piece Carmen was playing was indeed Chopin's Minute Waltz, one of the most technically demanding works in the classical piano repertoire. But she wasn't just managing to play it, she was playing it well. Very well. As Carmen continued, her confidence grew with each passing measure. Her right hand began to weave the intricate melody lines that made this piece so famous, while her left hand provided a steady, rhythmic foundation that drove the music forward. The combination was mesmerizing. The Technical demands of the piece began to increase, requiring rapid finger work and precise coordination between both hands. Carmen met each challenge effortlessly, her fingers flying across the keys with a speed and accuracy that left everyone in the room speechless. This wasn't the playing of an amateur who had gotten lucky with a few notes. This was the work of someone who truly understood music at its deepest level. Victoria Whitmore pressed her hand to her chest, her mouth hanging open in shock. She had hosted dozens of musical events over the years and had heard some of the world's finest pianists perform in her home. What she was hearing now belonged in that same category of excellence. "This can't be happening," Alexander muttered under his breath, but his words were barely audible over the growing intensity of Carmen's performance. The music was building toward one of the most challenging sections of the piece, a passage that required lightning-fast runs up and down the keyboard. Carmen approached it without hesitation, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that took decades to develop. The notes cascaded from the piano like water flowing over rocks, each one crystal clear and perfectly timed. People throughout the room began to lean forward, drawn into the music despite their confusion. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with the kind of emotional depth that could only come from someone who had lived through real joy and real pain. Carmen wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was telling a story with her music. Isabella found herself fighting back tears as she watched her mother transform before her eyes. This was like discovering that someone you had known your entire life was actually a completely different person. How had her mother kept this hidden? How had she never known that the woman who worked as a janitor, who struggled to pay bills, who had sacrificed everything for her family, was capable of creating such incredible beauty? Alexander's face had gone completely pale. The arrogant confidence that had defined his entire evening was crumbling away like a house built on sand. He was watching his assumptions, his prejudices, and his sense of superiority collapse in real time. This woman, whom he had dismissed as a simple janitor, was playing Chopin with a level of skill that rivaled his own. The piece entered its most technically demanding section, where both hands had to work in perfect coordination to create the illusion of multiple voices singing together. Carmen navigated it flawlessly, her years of training evident in every gesture. Her touch was sensitive and nuanced, bringing out subtle details in the music that many professional pianists missed. "Oh my God," someone gasped from the crowd. "She's incredible." The whispered comments seemed to break some kind of spell that had fallen over the room. People began to murmur to each other in amazement, trying to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't just competent playing. This was artistry of the highest order. Carmen's face had changed as she played. The uncertainty and discomfort that had marked her expression all evening had been replaced by something else entirely. She looked peaceful, focused, and completely in her element. This was clearly where she belonged, where she had always belonged. The music swirled around the room like a living thing, touching everyone present in ways they hadn't expected. Some guests found themselves moved to tears by the sheer beauty of what they were hearing. Others stood transfixed, unable to believe that such extraordinary talent had been hidden in plain sight. Alexander tried to maintain his composure, but his hands were shaking slightly. Everything he thought he knew about the world had just been turned upside down. This woman, whom he had treated with such condescension, was revealing herself to be a musician of extraordinary caliber. The humiliation was beginning to sink in, though the full weight of it wouldn't hit him until Carmen finished playing Dot. As the piece approached its conclusion, Carmen's playing became even more expressive. She was pouring decades of suppressed emotions into the music, channeling years of sacrifice and lost dreams into every note. The piano seemed to sing under her touch, producing sounds that ranged from whisper-soft to powerfully dramatic. Isabella was crying openly now, finally understanding. something about her mother that had been hidden for her entire life. This explained so many things that had never made sense before. The way her mother sometimes hummed complex melodies while she worked. The way she would stop and listen whenever classical music played on the radio. The way she had always insisted that Isabella take music lessons, even when money was tight. The final measures of the piece arrived with a flourish that showcased every aspect of Carmen's technical and artistic abilities. Her fingers flew across the keys in a dazzling display of virtuosity, building to a climax that filled the room with sound before settling into the gentle, graceful ending that made the minute waltz so beloved. As the last note faded into silence, Carmen's hands slowly lifted from the keys. She sat perfectly still for a moment, as if she was reluctant to break the spell that her music had created. The room remained silent, not because people didn't know what to say, but because they were afraid that speaking would somehow diminish the magic of what they had just experienced. Alexander stood completely motionless, his face a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning humiliation. The woman he had condescended to, the woman he had challenged to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, had just delivered a performance that was nothing short of masterful. The silence stretched on, becoming more profound with each passing second. Everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that would change how they thought about assumptions, about hidden talents, and about the dangerous game of judging people by their appearance or circumstances. Carmen finally turned on the piano bench to face the crowd, her eyes meeting Alexander's gaze directly. There was no triumph in her expression, no anger or vindication. Instead, there was something that looked almost like sadness, mixed with a quiet dignity that had been there all along for anyone who had bothered to look for it. The revelation was complete, but the questions were just beginning. The silence that followed Carmen's performance seemed to stretch into eternity. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. The only sound in the entire mansion was the faint ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner, marking time that felt frozen in place. Alexander Romano stood like a statue, his face completely drained of color. His mouth hung slightly open, and his eyes stared at Carmen with an expression that mixed disbelief, confusion, and the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about the world had just been turned completely upside down. Carmen remained seated at the piano bench, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She looked around the room at all the shocked faces staring back at her, and for the first time all evening, she seemed completely at peace. The nervous energy that had marked her presence throughout the fundraiser had disappeared, replaced by a calm dignity that was impossible to ignore. Isabella was the first person to break the silence. She pushed through the crowd of stunned guests, tears streaming down her face, and rushed to her mother's side. "Mama," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "why didn't you ever tell me?" Carmen looked up at her daughter with gentle eyes that held decades of untold stories. "There was no reason to tell you, Mia," she said softly. "That was a different life, a different person. That woman belonged to a world that no longer existed for us." Victoria Whitmore finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Carmen, that was absolutely extraordinary. I've never heard anything like it outside of a professional concert hall." The crowd began to murmur in agreement, people shaking their heads in amazement and confusion. How was this possible? How could a woman who worked as a hospital janitor play classical music with the skill of a world-class pianist? The questions hung in the air like fog, dense and impenetrable. A distinguished gentleman in his 70s, whom Alexander recognized as a retired music professor from Juilliard, stepped forward from the crowd. His face was pale with shock, and his hands were trembling slightly. "Excuse me," he said to Carmen, his voice shaky with emotion, "but I have to ask ... Have we met before? There's something about your playing style, something familiar. Carmen studied his face for a moment, and slowly a small smile appeared at the corners of her mouth. "Professor Martinez," she said quietly, "you probably don't remember me. It was a very long time ago." The old man's eyes widened in recognition, and he pressed his hand to his chest as if he had just seen a ghost. "Carmen Santos," he whispered, then shook his head. "No, wait. Not Santos. Rodriguez. Carmen Rodriguez Vasquez." The name hung in the air like a revelation that no one understood except Professor Martinez, whose face was now filled with a mixture of wonder and sadness. He turned to address the confused crowd, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his words clear and precise, "you have just witnessed a performance by one of the most gifted pianists of her generation." Carmen Rodriguez Vasquez was once considered among the finest young talents in classical music. She studied at the Mexico City Conservatory and later at the Manhattan School of Music. 30 years ago, she was destined for international stardom. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. People looked back and forth between Professor Martinez and Carmen, trying to process this impossible information. A woman who worked as a janitor had once been a professional classical pianist? It seemed too incredible to believe. Alexander felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "That's impossible," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "If she was really a professional musician, what is she doing working? As a janitor? Why would someone give up a career in classical music?" Isabella's tears were flowing freely now, but her expression had changed from confusion to a fierce, protective anger. She stood up from beside her mother and faced the crowd, her voice strong despite her emotions. "I'll tell you why," she said, her words cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "Because my father died when I was 2 years old, and my mother had a choice to make. She could pursue her dreams and leave her daughter to be raised by relatives in Mexico, or she could sacrifice everything to make sure her child had a better life." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It was the kind of quiet that comes when people realize they are hearing something profound and heartbreaking. Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "My mother gave up everything. She left behind her career, her dreams, her entire identity as a musician. She came to New York with nothing but a 2-year-old daughter and the determination to build a life for us. She took whatever work she could find to pay for food and rent and to make sure I could go to school and have opportunities she never had." Carmen reached up and gently took her daughter's hand, trying to quiet her, but Isabella wasn't finished. "For 30 years, Isabella continued, my mother has worked night shifts as a janitor. She's cleaned offices and hospitals while other people slept, saving every penny she could to pay for my education. She's worn second-hand clothes and lived in tiny apartments so that I could have piano lessons and school supplies and a chance at a better future." Victoria Whitmore was crying openly now, her hand pressed to her heart. Around the room, other guests were wiping away tears or staring at Carmen with newfound respect and understanding. "But she never stopped playing," Isabella said, her voice breaking slightly. "Every night when she came home from work, after I was asleep, she would sit at our old upright piano and play. I used to wake up sometimes and listen to her through the wall. I thought it was just a hobby, just something she did to relax. I never knew I was listening to someone who could have been performing at Carnegie Hall." Professor Martinez stepped forward again, his own eyes wet with tears. "Carmen was extraordinary," he told the crowd. "Her technique was flawless, but more than that, she had something that can't be taught. She had soul. When she played, it was like listening to pure emotion translated into music. We all believed she would become one of the great pianists of our time." Alexander felt sick to his stomach. The condescension he had shown Carmen, The way he had treated her like she was beneath him, the challenge he had issued so smugly, all of it was crashing down on him like a crushing weight. He had humiliated himself in front of everyone, but, worse than that, he had insulted a woman who had sacrificed more for her family than he had ever sacrificed for anything. Carmen finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I made my choice," she said simply. "I have never regretted it. My daughter is worth more than any career, any recognition, any applause. She is my greatest achievement, my most beautiful music." Isabella knelt down beside her mother's chair and embraced her tightly. "Mama, I'm so sorry. I never knew what you gave up for me. I never understood." "There was nothing to understand, Mia," Carmen replied, stroking her daughter's hair. "A mother does what she must do. Love doesn't require recognition or applause. It only requires action." The crowd watched this tender moment between mother and daughter, and many people found themselves thinking about the sacrifices their own parents had made, the dreams their mothers and fathers had given up to provide better lives for their children. Alexander stood apart from the group, feeling smaller and more ashamed than he had ever felt in his entire life. He had spent his whole career believing that talent and recognition were the same thing, that success was measured by applause and accolades. But looking at Carmen, seeing the dignity with which she had endured his insults, understanding the magnitude of what she had sacrificed, he realized how little he actually understood about true greatness. Professor Martinez approached Carmen with obvious reverence. "Carmen, I hope you know that your talent hasn't been wasted. Music like yours, it never really dies. It lives on, even when it's hidden. And tonight, you've reminded all of us what real artistry sounds like." Carmen smiled. "Sadly, thank you, Professor, but that life is over. I am just a mother now, and that is enough for me." "But it doesn't have to be over," Victoria Whitmore said suddenly, stepping forward with excitement in her voice. "Carmen, there are people who would give anything to hear you play. There are opportunities, possibilities." Carmen shook her head gently. "I appreciate your kindness, but this was just one moment, one song from the past. Tomorrow I will return to my work, and Isabella will continue building her own future. That is how it should be." The weight of Carmen's words settled over the room like a blanket of profound sadness and respect. Here was a woman who had touched greatness and walked away from it without bitterness or regret, who had chosen love over fame and family over fortune. In a room full of people who had achieved wealth and status, Carmen Rodriguez Vasquez stood as an example of something far more valuable than any of them had ever imagined. Carmen Santos remained seated at the piano bench, her weathered hand still resting on the keys as if she couldn't quite bring herself to let go of the connection she had just rediscovered. The room was filled with people who wanted to hear more, to understand more, but she seemed lost in her own thoughts, traveling back through decades of memories that she had carefully locked away. Isabella knelt beside her mother, still holding her hand, her eyes red from crying but filled with a new understanding of the woman who had raised her. "Mama," she said softly, "will you tell us about it? About what your life was like before?" Carmen looked around the room at all the expectant faces. These wealthy, successful people who had spent the evening talking about their achievements, their acquisitions, their plans for the future, were now waiting to hear about loss, sacrifice, and dreams that had been willingly abandoned. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "I was born in Mexico City," Carmen said, her voice steady but soft. "My father was a music teacher at the local elementary school, and my mother worked in a flower shop. We were not wealthy people, but our home was always filled with music. From the time I could walk, I was drawn to the piano like a moth to flame." She paused, her eyes focusing on something far away from the luxurious mansion where she sat. "My father noticed my interest when I was 3 years old. He would find me standing at our old upright piano, pressing the keys and listening to the sounds they made. By the time I was 4, I could play simple melodies just by hearing them once. Professor Martinez nodded knowingly. She was what we call a musical prodigy, he explained to the crowd. The kind of natural talent that appears maybe once in a generation. Carmen smiled slightly at the memory. My parents knew they couldn't afford proper music lessons, but they sacrificed everything to make sure I could study. My father took on extra work teaching private lessons in the evenings. My mother started making and selling flower arrangements from our home. They went without new clothes, without vacations, without anything that wasn't absolutely necessary so that I could have piano lessons. The crowd listened in rapt attention. Alexander, who had been standing in the back looking increasingly uncomfortable, found himself drawn closer despite his shame. There was something hypnotic about Carmen's voice, the way she told her story without bitterness or self-pity. By the time I was 10, Carmen continued, I was performing in local competitions and recitals. My teacher, Senora Gutierrez, told my parents that I had the potential to study at the finest conservatories in the world. She helped us apply for scholarships, wrote letters of recommendation, even paid for my audition recordings herself. Isabella squeezed her mother's hand. You never told me any of this. What was the point, Mia? Carmen replied gently. That was another lifetime, another person's story. Carmen's gaze drifted back to the piano keys. When I was 16, I received a full scholarship to study at the Mexico City Conservatory. It was like a dream come true. I studied with the finest teachers, practiced 8 hours a day, performed with symphony orchestras. For 4 years, music was my entire world. Victoria Whitmore leaned forward, completely absorbed in the story. What happened after the conservatory? I graduated with highest honors, Carmen said, a note of pride creeping into her voice for the first time. I was accepted into the master's program at the Manhattan School of Music in New York, another full scholarship. My professors said I was destined for Carnegie Hall, for international competitions, for recording contracts with major labels. She stopped speaking for a moment, and the silence was filled with the weight of what everyone knew was coming next. The tragic turn that had changed everything. I came to New York when I was 21, Carmen continued, her voice becoming softer. I had never been so far from home, but I was so excited about my future. I practiced constantly, performed in student recitals, competed in prestigious competitions. I won several awards, got the attention of important managers and conductors. Everything was falling into place exactly as my teachers had predicted. Professor Martinez spoke up again. I remember those days. Carmen was extraordinary. She had technique that rivaled pianists twice her age, but more importantly, she had something that couldn't be taught. When she played, she didn't just perform the music, she made it come alive. Carmen nodded gratefully at her old professor. Those were magical years. I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Music wasn't just my career, it was my identity, my purpose, my entire reason for existing. Alexander found himself thinking about his own relationship with music, how he had always seen it as a way to prove his superiority over others. Listening to Carmen describe her pure love for the art form made him feel even more ashamed of his own motivations. I met Roberto during my second year at Manhattan, Carmen continued, her voice becoming tender. He was studying engineering at Columbia, but he would come to my recitals whenever he could. He didn't know much about classical music, but he said my playing moved him in ways he couldn't explain. Isabella's eyes filled with tears again. She had grown up with very few memories of her father, who had died when she was so young. Roberto and I fell deeply in love, Carmen said. We were both poor students, living on scholarships and part-time jobs, but we were so happy. He supported my dreams completely, never questioning the long hours I spent practicing, never complaining about the uncertainty of a classical music career. He believed in me more than I believed in myself. Carmen's hands moved slightly on the piano keys, not pressing them but simply feeling their familiar texture. We got married during my final year at Manhattan. It was a small ceremony, just a few friends and Roberto's family. My parents couldn't afford to travel from Mexico, but they sent their blessing and their love. The room was completely silent except for Carmen's voice, which had taken on the quality of someone sharing sacred memories. After graduation, things started happening quickly. I was invited to audition for major orchestras, offered opportunities to perform solo recitals in important venues. My career was launching exactly as everyone had predicted. Roberto and I found a small apartment in Queens, nothing fancy, but it had room for a piano. We were building our life together, planning our future. Carmen paused, and everyone knew. They were approaching the heart of the tragedy. Isabella was born 3 years after I graduated, Carmen said, looking at her daughter with infinite tenderness. She was the most beautiful baby in the world, perfect in every way. Roberto was so proud, such a devoted father. Even when he was exhausted from his engineering job, he would come home and spend hours playing with her, singing to her, making her laugh. Isabella was crying silently now, hearing about the father she had barely known. For 2 years, we managed to balance everything. I continued performing, though less frequently because I wanted to spend time with Isabella. Roberto worked long hours to support us while my career was still building. We were tired. We struggled financially sometimes, but we were happy. We were a family. Carmen's voice began to shake slightly, and she took a moment to compose herself before continuing. Roberto was driving home from work on a rainy Thursday evening. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit his car at full speed. He died instantly. Isabella was 2 years old, and suddenly I was alone with a baby and no way to support us. The silence that followed was profound. Several people in the crowd were wiping away tears, moved by the raw pain in Carmen's voice. Roberto's life insurance was barely enough to cover his funeral expenses, Carmen continued. His family wanted to help, but they had their own struggles. My parents begged me to come back to Mexico, but I knew that if I left New York, if I abandoned the music world completely, I would never find my way back. Alexander realized he was holding his breath, completely absorbed in Carmen's story despite his own discomfort. So I made a choice, Carmen said simply. I could pursue my career and leave Isabella with relatives while I traveled and performed, or I could find a way to stay in New York and raise my daughter myself. For me, there was no choice at all. Isabella needed her mother more than the world needed another pianist. Victoria Whitmore spoke in a whisper, but surely there were other options? Ways to continue performing while raising your daughter? Carmen shook her head gently. A classical music career requires complete dedication. You have to be available for auditions, competitions, performances, often with very little notice. You have to be willing to travel anywhere, anytime. You have to invest years building relationships and reputation before you earn enough money to support a family. I had a 2-year-old daughter who needed stability, security, and her mother's presence. I couldn't give her those things and also pursue the kind of career I had been building. She looked around the room at all the successful people listening to her story. So I did what any mother would do. I found work that could support us, work that would let me be home with Isabella when she needed me. I took a job cleaning offices. At night, when Isabella was sleeping. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough for us to survive, and it meant I could be there when my daughter woke up in the morning. The weight of Carmen's sacrifice was beginning to settle on everyone in the room. The silence that followed Carmen's story seemed to last forever. Everyone in the room was processing what they had just heard, trying to understand the magnitude of sacrifice and love that had shaped this woman's life. But no one was struggling with the revelation more than Alexander Romano, who stood at the back of the crowd, feeling like his entire world had collapsed around him. Alexander had built his entire identity around being the best, around being superior to everyone else in his musical abilities. He had spent years believing that talent and recognition were the same thing, that success was measured by applause and critical acclaim. But standing there, looking at Carmen Santos, he realized how little he actually understood about music, about sacrifice, and about what it truly meant to be great. The shame was overwhelming. Every condescending word he had spoken, every smug smile, every assumption he had made about Carmen based on her appearance and her job, all of it was crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He had humiliated himself in front of everyone, but, more importantly, he had treated a woman of extraordinary talent and character with shocking disrespect. Carmen was still sitting at the piano, her hands resting gently on the keys as if she couldn't quite bring herself to break the connection she had rediscovered. Her daughter Isabella remained beside her, holding her hand and looking at her mother with newfound respect and understanding. Alexander knew he had to do something. He couldn't just stand there in the back of the room, hoping that everyone would forget what had happened. He had made a terrible mistake, and he needed to face the consequences of his actions. Taking a deep breath, he began walking slowly toward the piano. The crowd parted to let him through, and Alexander could feel their eyes on him as he approached. Some faces showed curiosity about what he would do next. Others showed disapproval and judgment for his earlier behavior. But Alexander no longer cared about what anyone else thought. All that mattered was making things right with Carmen. When he reached the piano, Alexander stopped and looked down at Carmen. She met his gaze calmly, without anger or bitterness, just a quiet dignity that made his shame even more profound. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Alexander found his voice. "Carmen," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology that goes far deeper than words can express." Carmen studied his face, seeing something different there than the arrogance that had marked his earlier behavior. "You don't owe me anything," she replied gently. "Yes, I do," Alexander insisted, his voice growing stronger. "What I did tonight was inexcusable. I treated you with condescension and disrespect based on nothing but my own ignorance and prejudice. I made assumptions about you that were not only wrong but cruel." He paused, struggling to find the right words to express the depth of his regret. "I have spent my entire career believing that I was better than other people because of my musical abilities. I thought that talent and success made me superior, made me worthy of respect that others didn't deserve. But you have shown me tonight that I understand nothing about true greatness." The crowd was listening intently to Alexander's words, watching this proud man humble himself before the woman he had insulted. Isabella squeezed her mother's hand, impressed despite herself by Alexander's willingness to admit his mistakes. "You sacrificed a career that could have brought you international fame and recognition," Alexander continued, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You gave up your dreams so that your daughter could have a better life. You worked jobs that most people would consider beneath them, not because you had to, but because you chose love over ambition. That is a kind of strength and nobility that I have never possessed." Carmen's expression softened slightly. She could see that Alexander's remorse was genuine, that his understanding had been fundamentally changed by the evening's events. Music is supposed to be about more than technical skill or public recognition, Alexander said, looking at the piano keys that had just produced such extraordinary beauty under Carmen's touch. "It's supposed to be about emotion, about truth, about connecting with something deeper than ourselves. Tonight, when you played, I heard what real music is supposed to sound like. I heard your story, your pain, your love for your daughter, all of it flowing through those notes." He looked back at Carmen, his eyes filled with respect that was completely different from the condescension he had shown earlier. "I have performed in the world's greatest concert halls, received standing ovations from thousands of people, earned critical acclaim from the most respected music journalists. But I have never created anything as beautiful or as meaningful as what you just played on this piano." Carmen was quiet for a moment, considering Alexander's words. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Alexander, music isn't a competition. It's not about who is better or worse, who deserves more recognition or respect. Music is a gift that we share with the world, each in our own way." Alexander nodded, beginning to understand what she meant. "You're right. I have spent so many years trying to prove that I was the best that I forgot why I started playing music in the first place. I forgot that it was supposed to bring joy, not just to audiences, but to myself." Victoria Whitmore stepped forward, her eyes bright with an idea that had been forming as she listened to the conversation. "Carmen," she said excitedly, "what Alexander said about sharing music with the world, he's absolutely right. Your talent is too extraordinary to remain hidden. There are people who would give anything to hear you play." Carmen shook her head gently. "Victoria, I appreciate your kindness, but that life is behind me. I have responsibilities, obligations. Isabella is starting college next year, and I need to focus on supporting her dreams now." "But what if there was a way to do both?" Victoria pressed. "What if we could create opportunities for you to perform that wouldn't interfere with your other responsibilities? Private recitals, charity events, small intimate concerts?" Isabella suddenly straightened up, looking at her mother with excitement. "Mama, you should consider it. You've given up so much for me over the years. Maybe it's time to let some of your own dreams come back to life." Carmen looked at her daughter with surprise. "Mia, you are my dream. You are my greatest achievement." "I know, Mama," Isabella replied, tears in her eyes. "But that doesn't mean you can't have other dreams, too. You've sacrificed everything for my future. Please, let me help you reclaim a little bit of yours." Alexander watched this exchange between mother and daughter, seeing the love and respect that flowed between them. An idea began forming in his mind, something that might help repair the damage he had done and honor the extraordinary woman he had so wrongly misjudged. "Carmen," Alexander said quietly, "would you consider playing something with me? A duet? I know I have no right to ask, given how I treated you earlier, but it would be an honor beyond words to make music with someone of your caliber." Carmen looked at Alexander for a long moment, seeing the genuine humility in his expression. "What did you have in mind?" Alexander thought for a moment. "Schubert's Fantasy in F minor for 4 hands. It's a piece that requires 2 pianists to work together as equals, each bringing their own interpretation while creating something unified and beautiful." Carmen smiled slightly. "I know that piece well. Roberto and I used to play it together when we were first married. He wasn't a trained pianist, but he learned it just so we could make music together. Then you know how beautiful it can be when 2 people truly listen to each other and blend their voices as one," Alexander said. "Would you give me the chance to learn that kind of musical partnership?" Carmen considered the request, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I would like that." Alexander moved to one side of the piano bench while Carmen shifted to make room for him. As they positioned themselves at the keyboard, the crowd gathered closer, sensing that they were about to witness something special. "Thank you," Alexander said quietly so only Carmen could hear, "for showing me what music really means, for teaching me that greatness has nothing to do with fame or recognition." and everything to do with love and sacrifice and staying true to what matters most. Carmen smiled and placed her hands over the keys. Music is a conversation, Alexander. Let's see what we have to say to each other. They began to play, and immediately it was clear that something magical was happening. Alexander's technical precision blended perfectly with Carmen's emotional depth. His years of professional training combined with her decades of life experience to create something that neither could have achieved alone. The music flowed through the room like a living thing, touching everyone who heard it. This wasn't a competition or a performance designed to impress. This was two musicians having a conversation through their instruments, sharing their stories and their understanding of what it meant to create beauty in the world. As they played, Alexander found himself letting go of his need to dominate and control the music. Instead, he listened to Carmen's interpretation and responded to it, allowing her emotional honesty to guide his own playing. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply making music for the pure joy of creating something beautiful. When the piece ended, the applause that followed was different from any Alexander had ever received.